the National Commission on Urbanization was created in 1985 and really got operational very soon after it was created. The big issue was that cities were not accommodating migrants. They were not making space for the poor. Now, this is a fundamental ideological conundrum, which is, can a city be for everybody? It makes it all the more important that we look back at what was done about 38 years ago by the National Commission on Urbanization so that we understand the genealogy of ideas that have been embedded into the ways that cities have been thought about and planned in our country. That is very interesting to read about before 1991, that there is a clear acknowledgement that there is a market economy at play. We also owe the National Commission the legacy of having highlighted for the first and only time, really, the importance of urbanization to India. They talk about the linkages, very importantly, the linkages between livelihoods, transportation, housing, and the larger city. The poor will take care of their own livelihoods and their own social upliftment if you allow them to do so. Create the space for it. Don't create barriers. Essentially, it rides on the assumption that because I came here first, and therefore because I own property, and I'm part of the indigent population, I have the right and the power to keep others out. Now, that is fundamentally unjust. The state has a responsibility to not allow for unequal consumption of resources. And land is the most fundamental resource in a city. The problem of housing, of course, sits at the heart of the urbanization challenge. If one cannot solve for that, then one is not solving for the urbanization challenge.
4 decades ago in 1985, the National Commission on Urbanization was created under the leadership of Charles Correa. Comprising of 17 volumes, the report published in 1988 was never officially accepted by the government and hence never published. Why is this report important to us today? We speak with Jagan Shah about this visionary report because he has known and worked with the people who made this report. Jagan Shah is an architect and urbanist with extensive experience in urban policy and practice. He was a senior infrastructure advisor in the UK government and the director of India's National Institute of Urban Affairs. He co-conceived the Smart Cities mission and expanded its impact. He guided the preparation of Master Plan for Delhi. He was a resident senior fellow at the IDSC Institute and Artha Global and is currently the CEO at InfraVision. Let's jump in and hear what he has to say about this report that you and I don't have access to and why it is important for cities and urbanization of the future. Jagan, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So when I spoke with you about a couple of weeks ago, or at least 2-3 weeks ago, you talked about this report that most people aren't aware of. And I've been working in this urban space for a long time, and I am not aware of this report even being there. It's called the Report of the National Commission on Urbanization, which was prepared in August 1988, more than 3.5 decades ago, right? And as you shared it with me and as I read through it, I kind of get the feeling that a lot of what has been said, we are still struggling to get around and implement it. How did you stumble upon this report? At what point in your work did you look at this report and think that it was substantial enough to be talked about?
It's been a long association with this particular report. It's a multi-volume report. I first encountered this when I was an undergraduate student at the School of Planning and Architecture in Delhi in the second half of the 1980s, when the report was just being prepared. In fact, the National Commission on Urbanization was created in 1985 and really got operational very soon after it was created. And then there was a fair bit of changes that took place in the terms of reference in the members of the commission and so on. The chairman of the commission was a visionary architect, Charles Correa, who had already by that time made a very good name for himself as an architect. But importantly, in 1982, he wrote a book called The New Landscape. And the new landscape was really an eye-opening text for somebody like me as an undergraduate in architecture, but very interested in the city. I was living in Delhi. I grew up in Delhi, and I was very much in love with the urban experience that Delhi was offering at that time, and wanted to do more research on the city. And this happened to be in our library, and I picked it up. First, the new landscape, read that, got very inspired because it was for the first time that one read what in those days was called the third world. One read a view that was coming from the third world about what we have to do with our cities. And that view was distinct from most other countries and most other books that one read, because it did not assume a certain level of development. It actually started from what was the ground reality in India at that time, and to a large extent still continues to be, which is a large amount of migration, a lot of it driven by distress from the rural areas, and urban poverty. And urban poverty created, in some fundamental sense, because of distortions and structural imbalances in the way that cities were being developed. For instance, the big issue was that cities were not accommodating migrants. They were not making space for the poor. Now, this is a fundamental ideological conundrum, which is, can a city be for everybody? Can the city not exclude? Is it not a function of the investments we make in land, and therefore should there not basically be a city which is only meant for those who can afford it? Now these are dilemmas. They don't get discussed a lot. And so when I discovered this as a very young aspiring architect, it completely changed one's orientation to things. Albeit we have to keep in mind that those were still sort of pre-1991 and pre-economic liberalization times. So in that sense, we were very steeped in the idea that the state is responsible for its citizens, that the state follows through on its commitments as per the directive principles of the Constitution of India, and the state is for everyone without exception. Now, those were, looking back now, those seem to be such utopian and, romantic ideas. But having said that, today where we are in 2024, where we are discovering, for instance, that we have not been able to eradicate poverty, that we have not been able to make cities that are for everyone and can accommodate everyone, we are faced with precisely the same kind of questions, albeit in a different context where land is a commodity, where property is a commodity, where the market operates in a much more visible, in a much more palpable way than it used to in the 1980s. And I think it makes it all the more important that we look back at what was done about 38 years ago by the National Commission on Urbanization, so that we understand the genealogy of ideas that have been embedded into the ways that cities have been thought about and planned in our country. When I say genealogy of ideas, I mean ideas such as social justice. Can we continue to think of the city as being a vehicle for achieving social justice? The National Commission on Urbanization said, in a very forceful way, said that the answer is yes, cities can be a vehicle for achieving social goals. They don't have to be a vehicle for the extreme inequality that we are currently seeing in our cities. They don't have to be a vehicle for conspicuous consumption by the wealthy, but can actually be, in that sense, equitable and accommodating. Now, the important thing about the National Commission on Urbanization was that it wasn't a woolly-headed, romantic group of people. Actually, almost every sort of quote-unquote guru that you can talk about in the urban sector today cut their teeth as younger researchers and younger experts 38 years ago in the National Commission on Urbanization. And so it was also a crucible for new thinking about cities. And in that context, what we realize is that they were not thinking romantically, they were thinking very pragmatically, which is that they recognized that there is a market, and that is very interesting to read about before 1991, that there is a clear acknowledgement that there is a market economy at play, but equally the acknowledgement and highlighting of the role of the state. And that's why the NCU report is so significant, because for the first time ever, and the only time in modern Indian history, that there has been a comprehensive stocktake of the entire urban system of the country.
Why do you think this was required? Who felt it was needed, and why did this come about? Why did we need a national commission? I know the 5-year plans had their own ways of state-led ways of creating cities, trying to manage them, creating of urban finance commissions, and getting the HUDCOs of the world set up. That was already happening. What was the reason for this?
That's a good question. I can't give you a very clear answer because I don't have access to information about the prehistory of the National Commission. In a sense, therefore, the story begins with the formation of the National Commission. But the Prime Minister at that time, Rajiv Gandhi, was, one can say from many different perspectives, was fairly visionary in his approach to shaping the agenda for statecraft, if one could call it that. And clearly had a very sort of close relationship with Charles Correa, who was the chairman and very much the thought leader behind the National Commission. So there was obviously a milieu at that time in which prime ministers and architects could talk with great comfort and weren't having a sort of a client-architect relationship, but more of a relationship of peers who could discuss solutions to issues. So it must have come about through through exchange of ideas that were enabled through networks that brought such disparate actors together. Having said that, if one looks at the terms of reference that were given to the Commission by the Ministry of Urban Development, at that time headed by Mohsina Kidwai, those terms of reference were broad and overarching. Perhaps the need might have been felt for giving greater definition to the work of the ministry itself. And the terms of reference read pretty much like the usual bureaucratic language that suggests that the Commission should take a view of the entire work of the ministry. Having said that, the entire work of the ministry was of a different tenor and of different quality at that time, because urbanization and urban development hadn't been recognized as it is today for being the kind of transformative phenomenon that it is. So in that sense, we also owe the National Commission the legacy of having highlighted for the first and only time, really, the importance of urbanization to India. But they placed it in the context of poverty eradication, in the context of livelihoods development, in dealing with migration, and dealing with structural inefficiencies in the system by which cities are developed, such as laws related to land ownership and such like. So, the Commission questioned a lot of premises that currently at that time had been put in place, such as the somewhat misguided view that the state could actually take ownership of land. So under the Urban Land Ceiling Regulation Act, which was later repealed, of course, but the Commission was very much behind modifying the Urban Land Ceiling Act so that it actually took account of the ground realities and was not simply an instrument of state control. So there were a lot of real world conditions in which this commission operated. And one can say that over the 3 years that it actually deliberated on its work, they touched upon all of the issues that are important to urban development, and brought in a whole galaxy of expertise, research expertise from different institutions, which are still today very prominent institutions and such like. So it excites me because it gives us one single overview of the entire urban system in the country, and it has not been done since then.
That's important because in order to check where it traveled and how much of these have gone forward, it is useful to remember that even the Nagarpalika Act at the 74th Amendment came in 1992 after all of this was done. Do you think you can draw a line between this and that? And do you think some of these have set other things in motion that we are not aware of? What do you think those could be?
Oh, there are a number of things. As I said, it helps us trace the genealogy of our ideas. So, take for instance the what you said, the Nagarpalika bill. It was clear that this was already in the works, and most probably in the works in the Planning Commission. It was being thought about. The Commission itself recommends very strongly a participatory process by which citizens actually have a say in what happens at the local level, right down to what later came to be called area sabhas. So they describe precisely the condition of the formation of area sabhas without using the term. So in some sense, that makes it all the more valuable because it comes from first principles. They've derived the need for consultative processes and participatory processes at the grassroots in cities without it being driven by the fact that there is a 74th Amendment in place, which is what we do today. So we hark back to the 74th Amendment again and again, and we do, so we're still counting decades, after which we're still not seeing the results. Having said that, this was a body of people that actually arrived at that same wisdom without having to enact it. And I don't think they even recommend that it should be enacted per se, but it should be treated as being good principles of good governance. There are ideas about transportation and mobility, for instance, which are clearly predicting the future because they talk about multimodal integration, the kind of stuff that we talk about in creating an urban mass transit authority, such as Bangalore has tried to set up. They talk about the linkages, very importantly, the linkages between livelihoods, transportation, housing, and the larger city. So, today we assume that these are very well linked, although a lot of people still need to be sort of educated about it. But we accept that because we see it, the need for proximity between work and workspaces and housing, for instance. Now, that was also described by the National Commission, and there are recommendations to that effect. They even talk about low carbon development, which is what we call it now, but they talk about the need to save energy and the sources of energy. Fossil fuels. I mean, so, they don't use the term fossil fuels, but they talk about basically energy sources and how those are important to a city. Now, these seem today to be staggering in their implications, because if those recommendations had been followed through in the 1980s or the 1990s, we would be seeing a very different pattern of urbanization today.
So virtual textbook, I'm just going through these sections, and each one of them has everything that we are trying to do today. And each one, if we go through, will take a lot of time for us, and each one could be a podcast episode of its own. But broadly, you talked about directive principles and delivery of social justice in urban areas. Today, let's talk about one of them first, which one you think we can pick. But I like the fact that you talked about social justice. Today, the inequalities are coming out because we believe, rightly so, that cities are economic engines. For some reason, we overemphasize that and underemphasize the fact that economy can be everywhere where there is trade happening between two people or exchange of goods and services happening. But this overemphasis on cities being the economic engine and the belief that the capitalist framework is going to get everybody out of poverty is true to a certain extent. But it is also true in that framework that you are going to be left with a lot of inequality, and it is a feature of capitalism or a bug, whatever you want to call it. It is going to have to do that at some level. How do you think we are dealing with urban poverty as a consequence, right? That is emergent because of that quality. And now we are having to have state take care of that market failure there and come back and see how are we going to equalize, how are we going to bring social justice, how are we going to address justice in general, right? Get the equalization, get some kind of equity going. What is your view on how the commission is looking at it in those days versus how it can be looked at now? Is there any difference, or is there truths from that can actually be applied? Because it's a big deal now.
Yeah, I think it's always been a big deal in the developing world because we still need to develop the sort of the commonwealth of the people of India to a level where it obviates the kinds of injustices and dehumanizing conditions that a lot of our citizens are subjected to. I think the interesting thing about the way that the NCU approached this was that it was not harping so much on the trickle-down theory so much. It wasn't saying, well, the wealthy are the ones that should create the wealth and the poor will feed off the same wealth, which is now a terribly sort of nefarious logic which is being imposed on us, on our thinking. It worked on what would broadly be called the enablement model, which was that the poor will take care of their own livelihoods and their own social upliftment if you allow them to do so. Create the space for it. Don't create barriers. And I think that's a very, very refreshing thing to read from something that is as old as the NCU is, because I believe that today we are in the sway of this assumption that we should just create wealth and it will filter down. It doesn't filter down. That idea of the trickle-down effect has been debunked most famously a few years ago by the London School of Economics, where they've done an in-depth study of it as well. And over multi-generational kind of data, it has been established that doesn't really happen because there are structural barriers. And so take, for instance, the fact that today we entertain the thought that we can keep migrants out of the city. Now, let's examine that, for instance, right? So I remember that even the Delhi master plan 20 years ago was actually, had the sort of the clarity, the unfortunate clarity to say that Delhi must keep migrants out, which is so peculiar because essentially it rides on the assumption that because I came here first and therefore because I own property and I'm part of the indigent population, I have the right and the power to keep others out. Now that is fundamentally unjust, right? It's fundamentally unjust because it deprives me of my right to the opportunity to make my own livelihood. Right. So it does a lot of problematic things to the overall goal of social justice. Now, unfortunately, also social justice itself has become a bit of a sort of what shall I say? It's become a banner under which a lot of arguments are made, while we realize that there are structural impediments to actually achieving it, and we are not able to actually face those impediments. So I believe that the Constitution of India was fundamentally about social justice because of the legacy of centuries of subjugation and, of course, the colonial period, which deprived us of that sort of vibrancy of every individual being able to contribute. So the National Commission on Urbanization actually talks about enabling conditions. Again, I'm using terms which we use today. They don't necessarily highlight those concepts, but essentially they say that the city should create the spaces, create the mechanisms by which people can find their way out of poverty. And I think that's a highly enlightened view, not a particularly new or earth-shattering view, but extremely cogently put across by looking at what are its implications in all aspects of urban development. So I think I think we have a glimpse there of how the argument for social justice can feed into the larger argument for development per se. Today we are in this kind of peculiar situation where achieving social justice is being perceived as being anti-development. Now, I believe that is a construct. That is a construct that is being foisted on us by a large sort of ecosystem of players that that want to question the very idea of social justice itself. Having said that, I believe that's what drives Indian society at a very, very implicit or a tacit level. That everyone has a right to find their own opportunities. But barriers exist. And today those barriers are becoming stronger and stronger. the fact that we cannot afford our houses, the fact that even affordable housing, so-called, is not being occupied by those for whom it is meant. And the government has to jump through hoops to try and make people occupy the houses that they are given, because it doesn't recognize that there is a dignity also in every part of our society, and the poor don't wish to be dealt with as if they are lacking dignity. So I think, in perspective, what one realizes is that there were far more enlightened ideas about the role of the state and about society itself that were informing the work of the National Commission. And that makes it all the more important.
I want to dwell a little bit on the housing and urban poverty. In fact, I'm trying to do a separate episode on housing and urban poor. But I was just reading the 9 points of the summary document. There were only 9 in the urban poverty. And none of it is actually talking about wealth distribution. 5.7, for example, says wage employment for urban poor should be provided through a program for creation of urban assets, such as water supply, drainage, land development, etc. So even the fact that it is talking about not giving cash, and it is talking about create assets for them to thrive, and all of those points are about create a structure, give them skills, give them the basic infrastructure. It is only talking about what the state is expected to do, and it is not. I think if anybody doesn't read this, they would say, oh, you're woke because you just want to take this money and give it there. Nothing in this in urban areas is even talking about distributing money. It is talking about enabling people to do that. But this is not, since we don't talk about this in this way, it is usually an assumption, like you said, that you are anti-development because you want to take this money away from the rich and give it there. And that can be prevalent because that is the fear you can instill in people. And social justice get a bad rap, right? Because of all these things. And they look at you as some kind of, anti-capitalist monk who just wants to destroy everything. Maybe there is a way of storytelling in this we need to explore, which we are not talking about. But regarding the housing itself, right, it's a big challenge in cities now, and it's an extension of the urban poor. One is closing the door behind you just because you came in first. You don't want everybody else to take the benefit of it. Another is that is probably a reaction, not even a response. It's a reaction to the situation that many others coming after you are making you worse off in some way, because the chase for the scarce resources is getting hotter. And that is probably the reaction, and we don't know how to deal with it. We don't know how to adjust when the pot is boiling and you're the frog. You don't know that you need to react differently. And housing is one of these things. I want to do a separate episode on that, but I just want to touch upon it. It never seems to work, whether you call it affordable housing, whether you call it economically weaker section. The industry is not able to do it. For some reason, like you said, why isn't it working? Let's ask it that way.
Well, my understanding about the problem with our approach to housing is that it cannot be premised on the assumption that land must always command its market value, right? I mean, that is the assumption that lies at the base of our inability to distribute resources fairly. Now, there is absolutely no way that most of India's citizens can actually afford to buy land in the places to which they migrate, because the livelihoods are all concentrated there. The big cities, Bangalore, Hyderabad, Mumbai, Delhi. Now, there is no way they can do that. So they end up being, quote unquote, squatters, right? Now, they are allowed to be squatters because there is a labor force that is required in the city. And we think that it's okay that they can squat. We will not allow them to be permanent residents here. And, in some fundamental sense, we can continue to exploit that inequality. They will always be hankering after opportunity to earn even that 100 rupees more. And we can squeeze them as hard as we want to before we pay that 100 rupees more. So it is a highly unequal and potentially very exploitative situation. Now, in that kind of situation, what is the role of the state? I think, we have to keep coming back to that, because this is as much a document that enlightens us about a different conception of how the state works or can work. Now, the state does not have to be beholden completely to market forces, and it isn't. So, if you look at the fact that subsidies in a different form, they're not called subsidies, but they're called, say, viability gap funding or, sweeteners, as they say. So land is provided as a sweetener in a public-private partnership where a corporation comes and builds a certain piece of infrastructure and then is allowed to actually use that land, monetize that land in order to recover some of their investment. Now, what is that? That is the state choosing to put a priority on, say, a public transport system or to put a priority on a particular type of land use and saying that, hey, we will give you a concession. We might even give you cash in order for you to build this, right? And that's what viability gap funding tends to be. Now, if that is the case, how much subsidy or, concession is required for us to actually accommodate the poor? How much is required? We never do those calculations, and perhaps after 1991, we haven't bothered to because we are in the sway of this sort of so-called capitalist, system, which is just blindness. I believe it's just blinkered vision of what is possible, because India has always been seen as the country that will produce the solutions that can help the entire global South and developing world. But I think we have failed to do that. We've only become sort of mimics of, so-called capitalist development of models of other countries, whereas we had the opportunity 40 years ago to reframe that conversation. Now, I say reframe because, for instance, if you take housing, the National Commission basically puts its weight behind one important model, which is what came to be called as sites and services, right? The sites and services approach, very famously utilized by the World Bank in many of its projects. A city like Chennai has a number of those projects, and they are flourishing settlements where the land and the basic infrastructure like water supply and sanitation was provided, but the housing was built by the beneficiaries. Okay. So the commission does dwell on that. It dwells on the fact that if you leave it to the people to build their own homes, they will build appropriately, they will build more frugally. There will not be the kind of ostentation that today has basically taken a grip on our society. Now, again, all of that seems to sound a little romantic, but I don't believe so. I think it's pragmatic. It's pragmatic to understand that those who live in squatter settlements and run their livelihoods from their homes need space for work as well. Very unlike the rich who can travel to their work, increasingly with faster modes of transport. The poor don't have the ability to spend that kind of money to commute across cities. And that's one of the reasons why affordable housing blocks don't get occupied, because they tend to be in locations where the jobs aren't there. Now, the commission goes into the details of this as well. They go into building technology. After all, the chairman was a famous architect. They go into this. They go into materials used by people to construct homes. They even do an analysis of whether or not India can afford to build in steel and concrete, whether it can build the high-rise, blocks. So there's so much there which needs to be debated even today. And they discovered that we simply don't have the resources, and truly India was lacking the amount of steel and concrete and cement that was needed if everybody had to be accommodated in high-rise blocks. They also recognize that the need for rental housing is extremely important. And that's one of the reasons why one of their sort of legal interventions was to relook at the the Rent Control Act. Right. So they recognize that the Rent Control Act is destroying the inner cities. Now, those inner cities are precisely where a lot of urban poor even today find their livelihoods, because those are thriving commercial centers. They're the central business districts and so on. So the diversity of jobs, the complexity of jobs is much higher. So you need everybody from a rickshaw puller to a lift operator to a CEO in those areas. So there is much more diversity, and therefore can accommodate more people. Now, in those kinds of locations, if you have rental housing available, then you're able to accommodate the migrant. Now, there was no assumption that the migrant is living below a certain poverty line or anything like that. Migrants are migrants. My parents were migrants. They came to Delhi, from Gujarat, because my father got a job in Delhi. So many people from around the country who were not landless and who were not disenfranchised or marginalized, they migrate because opportunity is why you migrate. And so it recognized all of this well before economic liberalization, right? So it recognized that cities are where opportunity lies. And why should we deprive people of their access to opportunity? And therefore, it touches upon all the levers that you have at your disposal. Rental housing. Therefore, they look at the Rent Control Act, the Urban Land Ceiling Regulation Act. They question it because clearly it is an overly onerous kind of an act. However, they do uphold the idea that surplus accumulation of land shouldn't be there. They even strongly propose that there should be a vacant land tax. Now, most of the developed economies have they force you to not speculate on the property that you have built or on the vacant land that you have. They force you not to do that. That's again evidence of state action. The state has a responsibility to not allow for unequal consumption of resources. And land is the most fundamental resource in a city. And we have simply allowed that political economy to continue, where today it is going to become absolutely impossible to create a sites and services scheme. We will keep putting the poor into high-rise 20-floor high blocks where they have no workspace possibilities, where, God forbid, if there is a disaster, we don't know what will happen in those situations because the density of population is high. And everybody is confined to using lifts and staircases, multiple floors of staircases. So what one realizes really is that the problem of housing, of course, sits at the heart of the urbanization challenge. And if one cannot solve for that, then one is not solving for the urbanization challenge.
Do you think it could be a structuring problem? Because if we know that when the state is trying to do this thing, there is no incentive for them. It is a cost, it's a headache, it needs to be done, it's probably a check mark somewhere. It is not seen as a lever because it is not a market failure in their head. It is a feature of capitalism in their head, which is this is how it works and this is how they live. And they are okay with living because that is the cost they can afford. Because the system is the market sets the value and at the transaction. And when they get into pricing, you've seen how it works. It is always broken. It is always cronyist. It is always rent seeking. That's where even the term comes from, right? So with all these structural problems, how is institution building important here? Because we are now reliant on decision making, which is not based on these kind of parameters that are well understood and articulated. There is no willingness to do that. How much of institution building is talked about? Because I see that there is a lot of centralization because of when it was in 88. There is a lot of center should set up a body for all of these things. But it also says state should also do the same. And it also says there should be participation at the lowest level. But I'm curious as to how do you think this whole report and the commission itself looked at institution building, not just state as a whole, but even creating these other structures? Does it even dwell into that? Because
it does.
State as a big unit is kind of, I feel, is not working now.
No, it does, of course. And the most fundamental aspect of that structure is the subsidiarity, is the governments at different level. And the National Commission puts its weight behind local government very clearly. It also as I mentioned, it also recommends that we go right down to the grassroots level. So area level, neighborhood level, or ward level kind of associations between citizens. So it decentralizes, and assumes that. And it also recommends that there should, for instance, in the Planning Commission, there should be a full-time member that is representing urban. Even today in the Niti Aayog, we don't have that. So it recognizes that. In terms of institutions, it talks about creating boards or authorities or whatever that are necessary in order to dispense the responsibility of the state in terms of housing or livelihood development and so on. So in terms of overall institutional structures, it doesn't shy away from making those recommendations. And I believe that as I mentioned in the case of the UMTA, quite a few of those thoughts seem to have filtered down into statecraft and have actually become part of our overall apparatus. But the apparatus is not being driven by the right motivations, and that's, like you said, that seems to be somewhat the problem. Now, if maximizing the value of land is the only thing that drives your thinking, then you might as well close shop. Why is there a housing board at all, for that matter? Now, unfortunately, the political economy around urbanization has also become somewhat vitiated. It's also now a political economy where there are quite a few signs one can see quite regularly that decisions of the state are tendentious. They are being driven by extraneous forces or influences rather than being driven by first principles. Now, if you are driven by first principles, you would realize that you would need to redistribute some land for sure. Now, take for instance a scheme that's been launched, which is, it's a non-starter almost. Nothing has been achieved in it. But the idea that there should be affordable rental housing complexes, ARHCs, which the ministry has launched, and this was launched around the time of the pandemic and after the mass migration out of cities. Now, Tamil Nadu, for instance, has created a separate corporation that creates working women's hostels. And those working women's hostels are located on industrial plots of land for industries. They are one-to-one sort of match between the need for a hostel for labor. Now, those are labor camps, essentially, but they are much better quality labor camps. That's not driven by self-determination at all. That is driven by a paucity of labor, and therefore, you're providing a certain facility. Fair enough. But having said that, when this scheme was launched, in the wake of the pandemic, there was a recommendation that public sector units should make their land available for building these. Now, there was a hint there that all of these large PSUs and the huge amounts of land that they own, which they no longer need, because the entire nature of industry itself has changed. And those are public lands, should be, in a sense, made available for this. Now, that I felt when I read it, and I wrote about it as well, felt like here's a great opportunity because, for a corporation that actually owns hectares of land, for them to even give 1 acre for the development of, rental housing or affordable housing seems to be a quite doable thing. I mean, it's common sense, right? That you can make that available. However, we have held on to the premise that corporation has the right to deny this, right? So this is another structural flaw in the way that we look at development per se, which is that public agencies, public corporations, which ostensibly serve the public good, are assuming the same rights as private owners, right? Now that's a flaw in logic. And yet we don't address that. We don't even critique the state for nurturing this kind of thinking. How is it that a public agency can refuse to let even a square foot of their land make available for public purposes? That's the question we need to ask ourselves. The National Commission on Urbanization, given the fact that their patron was was the Prime Minister himself, I think just believed that the government would do everything within its powers to enact or to implement what they were recommending. Today, we can't even think of making those suggestions because at the very base, we have started believing that it is not possible. But that is simply not true. That is simply not true, because what is held in the public interest, in the public trust, must be available for public purposes. But then, having said that, and this is where we need to come to our contemporary as well, we don't even discuss what is public interest, right? We don't even discuss that in our societies. What constitutes public interest? Public interest is neither the interest of a local population that has its vested interest in getting development done in their neighborhood or whatever. That's not how you would think about public interest, nor is it, this idea that by serving the needs of a particular, wealthy actor in the city, you are somehow serving public interest because wealth will trickle down. Neither of those two extremes are what we're talking about. We're talking about public interest being something that is like a social contract, that is debated, that is talked about, that is arrived at through discussion about what is beneficial to the larger public. And that debate has stopped happening in our country, and what I believe is happening as well is the clear exploitation of the opportunity to create vote banks. And so now we neither deny electricity, nor water supply, nor sanitation to those who are quote unquote squatters. We are regularizing, so to speak, but we are still at the same time wanting them out of our sight, and we are not willing to give them the land titles, for instance, that the Odisha government started distributing. Incidentally, when you mentioned that point about the urban wage employment, I mean, the Odisha government actually created a scheme for urban wage employment. They did that after the pandemic as well. So, I don't know whether somebody read the NCU report and arrived at that, but I believe that you would arrive at that if you thought from first principles, which is that you're building a lot of infrastructure all the time, all of the pavements and all of the street signage and street lighting. All of this is being constructed on a regular basis and maintained on a regular basis. Why does a migrant worker need to come to the city to do it? When the city is full of those who are capable of doing it locally. So we create a sort of a prevalence of homelessness. We don't allow the poor to find roots at all in the city. In every possible way, we displace them, and of course, we also use the bulldozer if necessary. That is the signs of a sort of an increasingly sickening state culture, where we have abandoned our ability to think of solutions that are for our people, rather than solutions that assume that we are serving our people, through some indirect means.
There are many things, right? The incumbents seem to think that they have arrived and they need to close the doors behind them. And at some places here, there are language issues. In some other places, it is cultural. It is something else, right? There are so many issues that comes out of people coming into a new place, making their livelihood, and suddenly there is, you are not us, we are not them. Even though each of us were migrants to where we are, we seem to want to close the door behind us. How do we have these conversations where it is inclusive? But with growth comes challenges because institutions are not strong. It is still so centralizing in, even if the centers ask the states to do something, the states don't want to give it to the city. Like I was just looking at that thing. It says create, when a corporation grows bigger than, I forgot what I was reading, but if it goes bigger than certain size, you need to break it up for that, right?
Yeah.
And this is what we are fighting for in that Bengaluru governance bill, that we just said break Bengaluru up into 10 corporations, but it's just getting bigger and bigger, swallowing up and becoming this big dinosaur, which it keeps wanting to eat because of populist reasons. People don't seem to understand what is the benefit of doing that. What does it mean to the people of the country to gain this knowledge? Why should they even care?
they should care because urbanization is not working out all that well for any of us. Today, the air quality index in the Delhi NCR is, like yesterday, above 400. Okay. We have aspirations, but we somehow have been trained to think of our aspirations only in terms of wealth creation. Whereas we have forgotten that wealth creation at the cost of your own health and longevity is not wealth creation, so no money in the world will buy you a better set of lungs.
Money creation, not wealth.
Money creation, indeed. So we are being trained to think differently. Now, don't ask me who is training us to think differently, because it's a large ecosystem of players that does that to serve their interests. But if we have to come to terms with the challenges of today, firstly, we must develop a sense of history. We must understand better about the evolution of our own cities. Each city and its city dwellers must understand where that city and why it has developed in a particular way, because every city develops differently. There are common features, but there are very specific features as well. The second is to look at the institutions carefully. And this is not work that the public is equipped to do, and to look at it carefully, and certainly to examine your point about what is the appropriate scale at which an institution can even deliver its obligations towards the citizens. Today, we are in a state where either you have a medium or small town where the city government basically does not have any capacity, or you have metropolitan locations where the city government has some capacity, but it certainly does not have sufficient capacity. Now, we have to spend public time on discussing in public, what does it mean to have the boots on the ground that governments require in order to dispense with their basic responsibilities, right? We don't have the boots on the ground. Now, you cannot create an army overnight to take care of our cities, which means citizens have to be part of it. And we have a citizenry that's highly aware, highly, conscious of their own interests. Why can we not turn that force towards a somewhat regulated process, so that people don't go off on tangents and start serving their own vested interests? How can we develop that new social contract is something we need to think about. I think in terms of the breaking down of municipal corporations and such like, I think these are all options on the table. There can be aggregation, there can be disaggregation. Again, what drives that thinking? It is the appropriateness of that solution, right? And as you said, there is the attempt to break the Bangalore administration down to a scale where it can become more responsive to citizens' needs. Now, we must also examine the question whether or not the purpose of that institution is to serve everybody's interests. So that's very important for us to keep in mind, because otherwise you would not have municipal corporations that keep money in the bank and don't use it. Famously, the Bombay Municipal Corporation has, I think it was 30,000 plus crores lying in its bank account and doesn't use it. Now, why doesn't it use that? What is, what's the answer to that question? Why doesn't it leverage that money for securing 20 times that from global financial institutions? Why does it not do business with public funds in a responsible way? So I think there is only questioning and debate ahead of us, because we have to fix this problem of cities in our country. Inequality is not the only problem. As I said, these cities are killing us. We are living in gas chambers if you're living in any of the large metropolitan urban centers. The second point is that opportunities are drying up. We have to keep that in mind. So there is already a repudiation of the metropolitan to for people to prefer the medium and small towns, the peripheral urbanization that's taking place. There is a clear reason. One is, of course, the barriers for entering the metropolitan is one aspect, but more substantively, the lack of opportunity. Opportunities are drying up because, in a sense, it's already crowded. There's already a lot of competition for every single job. Now, that's where, and I think this is the most crucial thing which we haven't talked about, comes the role of planning. Fundamentally, the National Commission on Urbanization was about planning. The Planning Commission was about planning. And there was the beginnings of a planning mindset that 38 years ago was informed by the National Commission on Urbanization with its thorough look at urbanization. We lost that track altogether. And we, thereafter, from the 1990s onward, have been entertaining the idea that urbanization as it currently happens is the way it happens. We've accepted it. But that is not true. Much poorer countries than us are able to regulate it. Countries at the same income levels are able to regulate, plan, enforce. Why we don't do that? There are a host of reasons. And I think so our inbuilt social hierarchies and our inbuilt disincentives for people to actually break out of those hierarchies, because there is a dependency, a safety net associated with being part of your own clan or caste or whatever. So all of these kinds of structural imbalances, they have to be addressed. Now, unless we change the nature of public discourse, that's not going to happen. Now, this sounds like as if political discourse is a silver bullet. But fundamentally, in a democracy, it is the silver bullet. There is no other way. We have to change the shape of public discourse. An analyst, from the United States, wrote in an article a few years ago that Indian cities will only really find their place in the sun after 2050, when the urban vote starts exceeding the numbers of people voting from rural areas. Now, that too is somewhat specious logic that simply those numbers will add up to the results that we want, simply because there is so much division. We are a divided society. And the National Commission also recognized that we are a divided society and therefore built a civic ideal to work towards. And what we are losing sight of are civic ideals, right? So we are accepting that there is a fragmentation, a ghettoization, of a complete dismemberment of the civic, way beyond the tragedy of the commons. Way beyond that. We have simply accepted that we are Indian and we live in divided cities. Now, that unfortunately is anathema to the very nature of cities. Because cities thrive on the sharing of common infrastructure, there is no way out of the question of what constitutes common infrastructure. What constitutes the public good created by infrastructure. There is no way of getting away from it. But we don't debate that because those spaces have been, taken away in some fundamental sense. And taken away by ourselves in many ways. We are responsible for this.
The answer, I feel, is in what you said and what the Commission is also talking about. In a fractured country like India, I don't want to use the word fractured, it is diverse. There are 50 kilometers outside each city, the language changes, the culture changes, the people change. The ability to blend in an urban space in the public commons becomes interesting, and active citizenship should drive subsidiarity, because it's still continually speak with Anjali many times about the master plan. I've had 2 episodes with her, and the common constraint is that if the master plan is not informed at the local level, because active citizenry is difficult today, it is extremely political. You have to fight to be an active citizen. You have to fight to even be an engaged citizen. One of the attempts of this podcast is also to continue to say, listen more, learn more, and try to take the next steps in getting agency for yourself. And then we can drive subsidiarity, because there is little bit of place ownership, little bit of interest-based, at least, action, that you come and say, hey, I have a problem now. This also relates back to what you were saying. Today morning, I read in the newspapers that because of all the flooding, the Karnataka government has constituted a body of experts, which are basically the industry captains. I don't doubt their intentions. They are well-meaning people, but they are not the people who have the expertise to solve the problems. They're going to continue to probably bring problems which are not their expertise and may apply the wrong set of solutions. People like you and others who actually have worked in this space should be a part of that committee. So we run to the same people who have caused the problems and try to ask them, can you help me solve the problem? And they're going to solve it in a different self-interested way. I think we're making wrong choices repeatedly, and this is eye-opening. Thanks for spending time with me, Jagan. Maybe sometime we should pick up one of these things and deep dive. Any concluding thoughts on some key things that we can take away from this whole thing?
No, I think, thanks, Satya. I mean, this was a great opportunity to kind of just reflect on a number of things. But I think I would just reinforce the importance of urban planning. At the end of the day, this is why the NCU is significant, because it put its entire weight behind planning. And we have almost developed an aversion to planning. We see planning as being, some kind of a hammer on our rights. And how that has come about is something we must ask ourselves. We must understand it. How have we developed an aversion for the very medicine that we need to take? And having said that, we do need to plan. And the failure of master planning in our country is a resounding evidence that we are doing things wrongly. Because no city, no urban development, no economic drivers, through cities can be created without planning. Planning is fundamental. And so I hope we do get an opportunity to discuss planning more. I've been closely associated with the Delhi Master Plan 2041, and, just as Anjali has been involved for Bangalore, I think we need to talk more and more about planning and planning also in a decentralized way. So I would leave you with the thought, and an interesting thought perhaps that we can pick up is that all master plans, for instance, have in themselves a certain hierarchy of planning. They talk about an overall city plan, which is like a land use plan. And then the end game, so to speak, for master planning is actually what are called local area plans. Not a single city in this country has prepared local area plans. Right. And there is a good reason for that. It's because the public itself militates against local area planning, and, a laissez-faire kind of scenario helps everybody. So that, the law of the jungle really operates in our cities. We need to change that. Civic law and law that actually helps everybody is what is required, and planning is at the heart of that.
Amazing. Thanks a lot, Jagan. I think what you said is interesting. I think the power of India's development lies in its strength of its institutions and the plans, and not necessarily in the heroes that we feel can bring us out of poverty that we're struggling with. The hero worship might be a problem in the long run. We need to set up institutions and plans that people follow diligently. It's a boring thing that we need to do, and not the fancy, flowery things that we need to do. On that thought, let us pick up the thread once again a little later. Thanks a bunch, Jagan.
Thank you. Thank you, Sathya.